It was a regular evening, just another night in what I thought was a normal, comfortable life. I was sitting in the kitchen sipping my tea, when I noticed something strange about my son. At first, it was subtle, a shift in the way he looked at me, a coldness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. But you know how it is, right? You try to push that feeling aside, tell yourself it's nothing. After all, we all have our off days, don't we? But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something was off, and I couldn't figure out what it was. Days went by, and I began to notice more signs. He was distant more than usual. The laughter we used to share felt forced. Our conversations became strained, like he was hiding something. And no matter how hard I tried to reach out, it was like he was slipping further away. It wasn't just the little things anymore. No, there was a palpable tension in the air. Felt it. Something was coming, and I didn't know if I was ready for it. But one thing was clear. Whatever it was, I wasn't prepared for the shocking revelation that would turn everything upside down. One night, I discovered something that shattered me. My son, the boy I raised, the one I'd given everything to, had been planning my death. Can you even imagine that? The very thought felt like a cruel joke. I didn't believe it at first. I thought I was losing my mind. But then, piece by piece, the truth began to emerge. Slowly, like a puzzle I wasn't sure I wanted to solve. My heart raced, my hands shook, and I felt this gut-wrenching sense of betrayal I could never have prepared for. The deep love I had for my son, the trust I'd put in him. It all seemed like a lie now. I remember sitting there, feeling paralyzed by the weight of the discovery. How had I missed this? How had I not seen the signs? My mind raced, running over every memory, every moment we shared, trying to make sense of it all. This wasn't just any betrayal. It was the deepest kind of family betrayal. The kind that cuts so deep, you wonder if you'll ever feel whole again. What would you do if you found out your child, the one you loved and raised, had been plotting something so horrific against you? It's a feeling of betrayal so profound. It feels like the very foundation of your life has crumbled beneath you. And here's the kicker. I still couldn't fully accept it. My mind kept telling me, no, it's impossible. But the evidence was there, and I couldn't ignore it. What kind of a mother wouldn't fight to survive when faced with something so dark? What kind of a mother wouldn't go to every length to protect her life, even from her own flesh and blood? I didn't know what came next. I had no idea how I was going to face him, how I was going to deal with the weight of this betrayal. I just knew that I had to uncover the truth. But it wasn't going to be easy. This wasn't just some petty disagreement or a misunderstanding. This was a deadly plan, something that could take my life. And I couldn't let that happen. So I took a deep breath, gathered every ounce of strength I had left, and made the decision to dig deeper into the truth. I had to know what I was dealing with, even if it meant facing my worst fear. But what I didn't realize was how far the deception would go. At first, it was easy to dismiss the little changes as nothing more than the normal ebb and flow of life. You know how it is, right? People change, relationships evolve, and sometimes things just feel different. But when I look back now, those subtle shifts were the first signs of something far more sinister brewing beneath the surface. I should have paid more attention. But hindsight, as they say, is 20/20ths. And when you're so deeply entwined in your own emotions, it's easy to miss the signs staring you right in the face. Started small. My son, who used to be so warm, so full of life, began withdrawing. Not in the typical teenage angst way, where they lock themselves in their room for hours. No, this was different. He would still be physically present in the house, but emotionally, he was miles away. I used to look forward to our talks, those moments of connection where he'd share his day or ask me about mine. But now, those conversations had become shallow, awkward, even forced. It was like he was talking to a stranger instead of his own mother. I remember one evening, I asked him how his day had gone, expecting the usual rambling about school or his friends, but instead, he barely muttered a response. He gave me a curt fine and quickly walked away. That was strange. My son had always been chatty, always full of energy, yet now, he seemed like he couldn't get away from me fast enough. I thought maybe he was just going through a phase, Maybe the pressures of growing up were starting to weigh on him. But it was the little things that started adding up. The way his eyes no longer met mine when we spoke. The way he would turn his back just slightly, like he was trying to distance himself physically before he distanced himself emotionally. My gut told me something wasn't right, but I kept telling myself I was overreacting. After all, he was still my son, and I knew him better than anyone. I'd raised him, loved him, nurtured him. How could I not see what was happening? But then the signs started getting harder to ignore. It wasn't just the lack of connection. It was the way he started acting strangely secretive. My son, who used to have no problem telling me every little detail about his life, now had locked phone screens, guarded conversations, and an aura of secrecy I hadn't seen before. And I couldn't help but wonder, what was he hiding from me? I'd walk past his room and hear him on the phone, whispering, his tone hurried, like he didn't want me to overhear. And I swear, every time I walked by, his conversations would abruptly stop. It wasn't just random. It felt deliberate. The phone would immediately go silent, as if he knew I was near, like he was protecting something. That was the first clue that something was wrong. The paranoia started to set in. I wasn't sure if it was just my imagination running wild, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something much darker going on. Was he in trouble? Was he keeping secrets from me? Or worse yet, was he involved in something dangerous that he didn't want me to know about? My instincts told me it was something far more sinister than just rebellious teenage behavior or normal growing pains. The unease grew, and I started watching him more closely. I noticed that his demeanor was changing. There was a coldness in his eyes, a hardness in his face that hadn't been there before. I remember one day he was sitting at the dinner table, and he looked at me in a way that sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't the loving, affectionate glance I was used to. No, it was distant, almost calculating. It was as though he was looking right through me. And that look lingered for a moment longer than I was comfortable with. It wasn't normal. It was unsettling. One day as I watched him, it hit me. He wasn't just withdrawing emotionally. He was becoming someone else. The son I thought I knew was slipping away, and in his place there was this stranger, this person I couldn't recognize. He had started isolating himself more. I'd find him in his room, doors locked, curtains drawn, sitting in silence, staring at his phone, completely shut off from the world around him. At first I thought it was just a phase, a symptom of him growing older and needing more space. But now, looking back, I see it as the first signs of something darker creeping in. He had started to pull away not just from me, but from everything he once held dear. And I couldn't figure out why. But then came the most chilling part, the way he started treating me. It wasn't overt, not at first, but there was a subtle change in how he interacted with me. The respect he once had for me, that admiration in his eyes, it was starting to fade. And in its place was something much colder, more distant. I caught him rolling his eyes at me once, and it was the way he did it. It wasn't playful, it wasn't casual. It was dismissive, even condescending. It was like he didn't care about me anymore. Hit me hard. I felt like I had been replaced, like I no longer mattered to him. As these small, seemingly insignificant changes continued, I began to wonder if this was just a phase, or if I had overlooked something deeper. Was this just typical teenage rebellion, or was there something more at play here? I couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was happening, something I wasn't seeing yet. And that's when I started questioning everything. Was this the beginning of something much more dangerous? Was my son really capable of the betrayal I now feared? The tension in the air was so thick, I could almost feel it pressing down on me, suffocating me. The silence between us felt heavier, laden with secrets, with lies, with something I couldn't name. That's when I realized, this wasn't just an emotional breakdown in our relationship. No, there was something more, something darker, something I didn't understand yet but was desperately trying to piece together. And little did I know, the signs were only the beginning of a much more horrific revelation that was about to unfold. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when the first real clue hit me. At this point, I had already begun to feel like something was off with my son. The little changes, the withdrawal, the coldness, the guarded behavior, had started to form a pattern. But until that moment, I hadn't had a concrete reason to really question him. Maybe I was being paranoid, maybe overthinking it. I mean, who would suspect their own child of plotting something so dark, right? But the universe has a funny way of revealing things when you're not ready. And that day, the truth began to seep into the cracks of my carefully constructed reality. It happened right in front of me. I had been sitting on the couch, casually scrolling through my phone, when I overheard a conversation between my son and someone on the other end of his phone. Now, let me tell you, I wasn't one to eavesdrop. I believe in respecting boundaries, especially when it comes to my son's privacy. But this conversation was different. I couldn't help it. It was as if the universe forced my attention toward it. And once I heard that first sentence, I knew I wasn't supposed to be hearing it. I was sitting there, minding my own business, when I heard the unmistakable sound of my son's voice, low and deliberate. I could hear only fragments at first, but they made my blood run cold. Words like, "Don't worry, it'll happen soon. It's all set up," and then the one that made my heart skip a beat. "She won't see it coming." Froze. My mind couldn't comprehend what I had just heard. Who was he talking to? And what was this "it" that he was referring to? I couldn't move. My hands were trembling. I didn't know if I should confront him right there, if I should walk in and demand answers, or if I should run out of the room, hide from the truth that was beginning to unfold before me. But I stayed still. I stayed silent, frozen in place, as my son continued the conversation with that same eerie calmness. I didn't dare move closer. I didn't want to interrupt or make it obvious that I was listening. I just had to hear more to understand what was happening. "You're sure everything is in place, right?" he asked. "It has to happen exactly as we planned, no mistakes." She trusts me, and I can't afford to lose her trust. Not now. At that moment, everything inside of me screamed that I had to know the full truth. What was this? Was this some twisted game? A prank? Had to be, right? But no, deep down I knew. I knew this wasn't some joke. The seriousness in his voice, the way he was speaking, it was cold, calculated. My son, my flesh and blood, was involved in something that chilled me to my core. I could hear the faint voice on the other end, but it was muffled enough that I couldn't make out exactly what they were saying. But I could tell from the way my son responded that the conversation was about something far more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. I didn't know if I should confront him right then and there, drag the truth out of him, or if I should just back off and pretend I didn't hear anything at all. The fear, the confusion, the gut-wrenching betrayal, all swirled together inside me, making it hard to think clearly. My heart was racing. I could feel the pressure building in my chest, as though the weight of what was happening was too much for me to carry. Was I really hearing this? Was my son really involved in something like this? A part of me kept whispering, "No, it can't be. He's my son. He wouldn't do this. He couldn't." But the other part of me, the part that was listening to those words, the part that had already seen the warning signs, told me that I had to face the truth. No matter how painful, no matter how unimaginable, I couldn't ignore what was happening. When the conversation ended, I couldn't bring myself to approach him immediately. Felt paralyzed. How do you even begin to process something like this? How do you confront your own child about something so horrific? My mind raced in circles, each thought more disturbing than the last. How long had this been going on? How had I missed it? How could I have raised a child capable of such manipulation? This wasn't just a simple lie. This wasn't a small betrayal. This was the kind of betrayal that could cost me my life. The weight of that thought nearly crushed me. And then came the guilt, the overwhelming, suffocating guilt. I felt guilty for not noticing sooner. Guilty for trusting him, for not questioning his behavior more thoroughly. After everything we had been through, how had I allowed myself to be blind to the truth? How had I failed to see that the son I loved and nurtured could harbor such dangerous intentions? My mind was screaming at me, telling me to act, to confront him. But fear held me back. Fear of what I would learn. Fear of what it would mean for the future of our relationship. And fear of what would happen if I was wrong. That's when the second wave of realization hit me. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, a phase, or a normal growing pain. No, this was something far darker, something I couldn't even fully grasp at that moment. But it was real. It was terrifyingly real. And I had to face it, whether I was ready or not. But how? How does a mother face the possibility that her child is plotting something so unimaginable against her? How do you confront a betrayal that cuts so deep? It makes you question everything you thought you knew about love, trust, and family. And that was the moment I knew. This was just the beginning. The next steps, the next decisions I would have to make would change everything. And as I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, I realized I had to dig deeper. I couldn't just ignore this anymore. It wasn't just about my son's strange behavior. It wasn't just about his coldness or distance. No, now it was about survival. It was about unmasking the truth, no matter how horrifying it might be. I stood there, my body frozen with fear, as the weight of the conversation I had overheard started to settle in. The chilling words still echoed in my mind. She won't see it coming. Every time I replayed it, my heart sank a little deeper. There was no denying it now. This wasn't just a strange phase or some misunderstanding. My son, the boy I had raised, the one I had trusted with everything, was planning something unspeakable. But what exactly? How far had he gone? How much of this was real? These were the questions that haunted me, keeping me up at night, making my stomach churn with a nauseating blend of disbelief and fear. I had to know the truth, and not just the pieces of it. I needed to understand the full extent of what was happening, no matter how devastating it might be. I couldn't keep living in this shadow of uncertainty, this constant state of emotional turmoil. And so, I began my investigation. An investigation that would take me into places I never imagined I'd go, to truths I wasn't sure I wanted to find. At first, I didn't know where to start. How do you investigate something like this? How do you even begin to confront your own flesh and blood with such a horrific accusation? There was no manual for this. No guide for how to handle the betrayal of this magnitude. But I wasn't going to let fear stop me. I had already made up my mind. I needed answers, and I was going to find them. The first thing I did was start paying attention to every little detail. I knew that the answers I sought wouldn't just come to me all at once. No, the truth would come in fragments, in whispers, in tiny moments that could easily be overlooked if I wasn't paying close attention. So I started watching. I observed his every movement, listened carefully to every word he said, even when he didn't realize I was listening. Every time he got off the phone, I'd watch the way he quickly put it down and walk away. He was so careful, so meticulous, as if he knew he had to hide something. I noticed the little things. The way he always locked his phone when he left the room, or how he would glance over his shoulder as though checking to see if anyone was watching. It was these small, seemingly insignificant actions that began to unravel the deeper layers of the mystery. I also started looking through his things. I hated the idea of invading his privacy like this, but what choice did I have? How else could I find out what was going on? Every time he left the house, I would check his room. I didn't want to, but I couldn't stop myself. I needed answers. There were notebooks, scattered pieces of paper, and little scraps of information that seemed out of place. I began to see patterns, notes written in strange shorthand, dates circled in red ink, things that didn't make sense at first but, with time, began to form a clearer picture. It was as if I was piecing together a jigsaw puzzle, each small discovery pulling me deeper into this web of deception. One day I found something that made my blood run cold. Hidden in the back of his drawer, I found a letter. At first, I thought it was just a scrap of paper, but as I unfolded it, I realized it was something far more sinister. The letter was addressed to someone named Chris, and it spoke of a plan that was going to take place soon, too soon. The more I read, the more my stomach turned. The letter outlined details that sent shivers down my spine. It mentioned my name several times, and each time it was followed by phrases like, "Make sure she doesn't suspect anything," and "everything must go according to plan." The word "soon" was repeated several times. I felt a sickening wave of panic rise in me. My son wasn't just involved in something dark. He was orchestrating something. something that involved me, and the more I read, the more I realized I wasn't just a victim in this twisted drama. I was the target. I knew I had to dig deeper. I couldn't let this slip away. I couldn't let the fear of confronting the truth stop me. Every moment I spent in doubt, I was giving him more time to carry out whatever twisted scheme he had in mind. I had to act, and I had to act quickly. So, I began to look into his interactions more closely. I started monitoring his social media, his phone records, anything I could access without arousing suspicion. What I found was both disturbing and confirming. There were messages between him and Chris that were clear, deliberate, and terrifyingly cold. They spoke about setting the stage, about making sure no one would suspect a thing, about the need for complete secrecy. My son's behavior was no longer just strange. It was calculated, planned, and purposeful. He wasn't just acting out. He was executing a plan. And the more I dug, the more pieces of the puzzle fell into place. I could feel the tension building inside me, the dread gnawing at the back of my mind. I wanted to scream, to confront him right then and there, but I couldn't. Not yet. I wasn't ready to face him. Not when I still didn't have all the answers. What if I was wrong? What if I confronted him with nothing but suspicion and doubt? I couldn't risk it. Had to be sure. I had to gather everything I could before I made my move. The more I uncovered, the more I began to feel the weight of what was coming. I could see the endgame taking shape in front of me, and it terrified me. My son, my flesh and blood, wasn't just a confused teenager going through a phase. He wasn't just acting out because of peer pressure or some other external force. No, he was orchestrating a plan. A deadly plan. A plan that, if carried out, would change everything. And as each day passed, I realized I was running out of time. Every new discovery made my heart race faster, my mind spinning with questions. How had I missed this? How had I been blind to all of it? But there was no time for self-pity now. No time for second-guessing. The truth was right in front of me, and there was no turning back. Had to face it. I had to confront the reality of what was happening, even if it meant tearing apart the fragile sense of security I had built for myself over the years. And yet, as I continued my investigation, I began to feel a strange mixture of emotions. Fear, doubt, and disbelief, yes, but also something else. Something darker. A part of me couldn't help but wonder how far my son had gone in his plans. How much had he already set in motion? And who was involved in all of this? The more I uncovered, the more I realized that this wasn't just about my son. This was a much bigger web of deception, a family betrayal that went deeper than I could have ever imagined. The deeper I dug, the more I realized that this was no longer just a matter of finding the truth. It was about survival. My survival. And now it was a race against time. I had to find out everything I could before it was too late. When you're faced with a betrayal of this magnitude, it isn't just the action itself that devastates you. It's the internal battle, the emotional conflict that rages within you. It's like being torn in two. On one side, there's the unconditional love, the bond that you've spent years nurturing, and on the other, there's the cold, harsh reality of the betrayal staring you in the face. It's a feeling so intense, so conflicting, that it's impossible to describe in a way that does it justice. No matter how much you think you're prepared for it, nothing can truly prepare you for the moment when you realize the one person you trusted most in this world, your child, has turned against you. For days, I was in a state of emotional turmoil, a whirlwind of thoughts and feelings that I couldn't control. I would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, asking myself over and over, how could he do this? How could my son, the one I loved with all my heart, the one I'd given everything for, be capable of such treachery? The love I felt for him was so deeply ingrained in me that I couldn't fathom how it had gotten to this point. But the more I thought about it, the more I began to realize. My son wasn't the same person anymore. The person I had raised was slipping away, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. Someone who was capable of deception, manipulation, and betrayal. I remember one particular evening, just a few days after discovering the full extent of his plot, sitting alone in the living room, trying to come to terms with everything. The house was quiet, too quiet. And I sat there, feeling this overwhelming sense of emptiness, this void where the trust between us used to be. I kept replaying the good times in my head. His first steps, his first words, all the birthday parties, all the moments when I felt like the luckiest mother alive to have him as my son. And now, all of that seemed so far away. As if it were part of a dream that had been shattered. I kept asking myself, how could I love someone who had such dark intentions toward me? It was as if the very foundation of my life had cracked, and I was left standing in the rubble, trying to figure out how to rebuild. I loved him. I truly did. But the more I uncovered, the more I realized that this wasn't just a phase or a mistake. No, this was deliberate. He had thought this through. He had planned it. And that realization cut me to the core. The emotional conflict was unbearable. On one hand, I wanted to protect him. I wanted to believe that deep down, this wasn't who he truly was. After all, he was my son. How could I not try to protect him from whatever was clouding his judgment? But on the other hand, I knew that to continue protecting him, to continue shielding him from the consequences of his actions, would be to condone what he had done. And that was a line I couldn't cross. This wasn't just about family loyalty anymore. It was about survival. My survival. And that's when the guilt hit me. Was I responsible for this? Had I failed him as a mother? It was a question that gnawed at me, making it even harder to breathe. After all, didn't every mother wonder where she went wrong when something like this happened? How could I have been blind to the signs? Where had I failed to see the changes in him, to notice the subtle shift that had been taking place right under my nose? It was as though I had failed him in the most fundamental way. And yet, at the same time, I knew that the person he had become was not my fault. This wasn't my doing. This was his choice. But that didn't make it any easier to accept. As the days passed, I found myself grappling with a sense of betrayal that went beyond anything I could have imagined. It wasn't just the plot against me, though that in itself was terrifying. No, it was the fact that my son, my child, had so fully embraced this dark plan, this deadly intention. It was as though the love I had poured into him, the lessons I had taught him, the values I had instilled, meant nothing. It felt like everything I had done for him, every sacrifice, every moment of joy, had been erased in an instant, replaced by a cold, calculated desire for something else. And I wasn't sure what that something else was. Revenge. Power. A twisted form of freedom. I couldn't bring myself to confront him yet. I wasn't ready. I wasn't sure I ever would be. How do you confront your own child when the truth is so painful, so destructive? How do you even begin to explain that the very love you had for him is now tainted by his betrayal? I wasn't sure I was strong enough for that conversation. And yet, at the same time, I knew it was inevitable. The truth couldn't stay buried forever. There were moments, brief, fleeting moments, when I thought maybe he was still the child I had once known. Maybe this was all a mistake. Maybe he hadn't really meant it. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that these were just fleeting hopes, delusions I was clinging to in an effort to preserve the relationship we once had. The truth was staring me in the face, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. My son had become someone else, someone capable of manipulating and betraying me in ways I couldn't even begin to understand. And in those moments of emotional conflict, I began to realize something else. This wasn't just about him. It was about me too. About what I was willing to do to protect myself. What I was willing to let go of. This wasn't just about saving him. It was about saving myself from the devastating impact of his betrayal. And that was something I wasn't sure I was prepared to face. By now, I had gathered enough pieces of the puzzle, but there was still one part, one crucial piece that I hadn't fully understood. The vague references, the mysterious conversations, the little scraps of paper. Everything was beginning to form a clearer picture. But even as I pieced everything together, I still couldn't fully comprehend the enormity of what my son had been planning. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something even darker waiting for me, something I hadn't yet uncovered. The truth, I feared, was more horrifying than I could have ever imagined. It was a rainy afternoon when the final revelation came crashing down. I was going through some old records, trying to find a pattern, something that would link all of this together. I wasn't sure what I was hoping to find, But I felt like I was on the edge of something, like the last thread was about to snap, and everything would fall into place. And then it happened. Found it. The document. It was tucked away. Hidden in the back of a drawer where I'd never think to look. Something I had missed countless times before. But this time it was there waiting for me. The paper wasn't much. Just a few typed lines, but those few lines were enough to send my world into a tailspin. The document was a plan. A detailed, methodical plan. And it wasn't just any plan. It was a blueprint for my murder. The words jumped out at me, each one like a knife to my heart. Eliminate the obstacle. Make it look like an accident. No trace, no evidence. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I could barely even comprehend what I was seeing. This was no longer just a suspicion. It wasn't just a feeling of betrayal. No, this was real. This was a cold, calculated plot. And my son had been orchestrating it all along. First I thought I was reading it wrong. Maybe it was a joke. Maybe it was some twisted fantasy he'd written down. But the more I read, the more I understood. This wasn't a joke. This was a plan. A deadly plan. And what hit me hardest wasn't just the coldness of it. It was the way he had been manipulating everything around him, carefully setting the stage for his ultimate betrayal. He had been playing a game I hadn't even known I was a part of. And in that moment everything changed. I wasn't just dealing with a rebellious child anymore. I was dealing with a person capable of the most chilling betrayal. Someone who had been planning to take my life. I remember sitting there in stunned silence, staring at the paper. My hands shook, my heart raced, and my mind struggled to catch up with what I was reading. How had I missed this? How had I not seen the signs? All the subtle changes, all the moments of tension, they were all leading up to this. This moment. The moment when I realized that my son had been planning my death with the precision of someone who had no remorse. Someone who had no love for me left. And as the weight of that truth settled in, I felt like the ground had been ripped out from beneath me. But the most terrifying part wasn't even the plan itself. It was the realization that this wasn't just about me anymore. This was about him, my son, my flesh and blood, and what he had become. The manipulation, the lies, the deceit, it had all led to this point. And in that moment, I realized that my son wasn't the person I thought he was. The person I had loved, the child I had raised, was gone. In his place stood a stranger with dark intentions. And that stranger had been manipulating me all along. I tried to wrap my mind around it. How could this be possible? How could the love I had given, the trust one had placed in him, be twisted into something so horrific? My heart ached. Felt like I was suffocating. The betrayal wasn't just in his actions. It was in the fact that I had been blind to it for so long. I had been walking through this life, believing that I had raised a good person, a person I could trust with my life. But now I was faced with the shocking truth that I had been wrong. So wrong. The emotional impact of the revelation was staggering. My mind was overwhelmed by a flood of emotions. Fear, guilt, anger, and a deep, gnawing sense of disbelief. How could this be happening? How could my son, the one I had given everything for, the one I had loved unconditionally, be capable of something so monstrous? The pain of that realization was almost unbearable. It felt like I was living in a nightmare, one where every step I took only brought me closer to the darkness I had been too afraid to see. And yet, as the reality of the situation set in, I knew there was no turning back. There was no pretending that things were normal. There was no going back to the way things used to be. My son had made his choice, and in doing so, he had severed the bond we once shared. That bond, the one built on trust, on love, on shared memories, was gone. And in its place was a cold, unfeeling plot, a plot that threatened everything I held dear. But even in the face of such overwhelming darkness, I knew I couldn't let this be the end. I couldn't let the truth be buried. I couldn't let the man my son had become continue his dangerous game. No matter how painful, no matter how impossible it seemed, I had to confront him. I had to face the reality of what he had done. And I had to find a way to stop the plan before it was too late. In the quiet of that moment, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let him win. I wasn't going to let him destroy me. no matter how far he had gone, no matter how deeply he had betrayed me. The truth had been uncovered, and now it was time to confront it. It was time to face the boy I once knew and the man he had become. It was time to stop the plot, and to find a way to heal, to survive in spite of it all. I could feel the tension in my body as the moment of confrontation drew nearer. It had taken me days, maybe even weeks, to gather the courage to face my son with the full truth. The weight of what I had uncovered, the betrayal, the dark plan, the emotional devastation, had been slowly eating away at me, but it was nothing compared to the weight I felt now. I knew this moment would change everything. No matter how it went, no matter what he said, there would be no going back. And I wasn't sure I was ready for the fallout. But I had no choice. The truth was no longer something I could ignore or avoid. I had seen the darkness that had consumed him, and I had to face it, even if it meant losing him forever. Because, deep down, I knew that if I didn't confront him now, if I didn't confront the horror that had taken root in his soul, I would never be able to move on. I would never be able to heal. Had to do this. For myself. For my survival. I remember the moment I decided to confront him. It wasn't planned. It wasn't some grand speech I had rehearsed. Just happened. One night, as he walked into the living room, his eyes avoiding mine as usual, I just couldn't hold it in anymore. I stood up and, without thinking, I spoke the words that had been building up in me for so long. "I know what you've been planning," I said, my voice trembling but firm. His face went pale, his expression shifting instantly from indifference to something I couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe? Guilt? It was hard to tell. He didn't say anything at first, but I could see the walls starting to go up. He knew I had found out. There was no denying it now. I took a step closer, not wanting to give him any more space to hide behind his lies. "I know about the plan, the details, the people involved. I know what you've been doing behind my back. And I need to understand why." For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. It stretched out, thick and suffocating, until I could barely breathe. My heart raced as I watched him, waiting for him to speak, to give me the explanation I had been desperately craving. But all he did was stare at the floor, avoiding my gaze, and I could tell. He wasn't ready to face me, not yet. The pain in my chest was unbearable. How could this be happening? How could my son, my own flesh and blood, be so cold, so distant? How could he have plotted my death, manipulated me, and treated me like an enemy instead of a mother? Finally he spoke. His voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through me like a knife. "You don't understand," he said, his tone defensive, almost pleading. "You don't understand what I've had to do, the things I've had to go through. I didn't have a choice." I felt my blood boil. "You didn't have a choice," I echoed, disbelief flooding my voice. "You chose this. You chose to betray me, to plan my death. You could have come to me, talked to me, but instead you chose to lie, to manipulate, to plot behind my back. And now you're telling me you didn't have a choice." He flinched, but there was no apology in his eyes. No remorse. And that's when it hit me. He wasn't sorry. He wasn't sorry for what he had done. There was no guilt, no shame. There was only a coldness, a detachment that sent a shiver down my spine. "I didn't want to do it," he said quietly, still not looking at me. "But you wouldn't listen. You never listened. You never understood." The pain I felt in that moment was overwhelming. How could he say that? How could he justify what he had done, what he had planned, by blaming me? It was as if all the years of love and sacrifice meant nothing to him. As if everything we had been through together had been erased by his twisted perception of reality. "You think this was my fault?" I asked, my voice cracking with emotion. "You think I made you do this? You think I made you plan to kill me? You've completely lost sight of everything, haven't you?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stood there, his shoulders slumped, his eyes still fixed on the floor. I could see the defiance in him, but I could also see the cracks starting to form. Deep down I knew that he was scared. He was terrified, and that terrified me even more. This wasn't just about a plot anymore. It was about something deeper, something broken inside him that he couldn't face. And in that moment, I realized that no matter how much I loved him, no matter how much I wanted to believe that he was still the boy I had raised, I had to accept that he had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. "Why didn't you come to me?" I asked softly, the question that had been burning in me for days. "Why didn't you tell me what was going on? Why didn't you trust me?" He met my gaze then, finally looking up at me. His eyes were empty, hollow, as if everything inside him had been drained out. "You wouldn't understand," he said again, the words barely audible. "You never did." And in that moment I knew. He was lost. He was too far gone. The son I had raised, the boy who once trusted me with everything, was gone. This was no longer just a matter of betrayal. This was a breakdown of everything we had ever been, everything I had ever believed in. And that realization crushed me. But there was no turning back now. I had confronted the truth, and I had faced him. And now I had to deal with the aftermath. The room fell silent again, but this time it wasn't the silence of uncertainty. No, it was the silence of a relationship irrevocably broken. The son I had once known was no longer there, and the man who stood before me was a stranger. A stranger who had been consumed by something darker, something beyond my reach. But even as the weight of that truth settled in, I knew this wasn't the end. It wasn't over. The plot had been uncovered, the confrontation had happened, but the journey was far from over. Now I had to figure out what came next. How do you survive after something like this? How do you rebuild after everything you thought you knew has been shattered? The confrontation had happened. The truth was laid bare before me, and in many ways, it was even worse than I had imagined. The weight of it all, the betrayal, the plan, the cruelty of it, had hit me like a ton of bricks, and I found myself reeling, unable to fully process the magnitude of what had just transpired. But as the days passed, the reality began to settle in. This wasn't some nightmare I could wake up from. This was my life now. The son I had raised, the boy I loved with all my heart, had become a stranger, someone capable of the most unimaginable betrayal. The emotional fallout from that confrontation was like nothing I had ever experienced. One minute I was staring at him, trying to wrap my head around what he had said, and the next I was left alone with the crushing weight of it all. There were days when I couldn't move, couldn't speak, as if the shock had left me paralyzed. How does a mother cope when she learns that her child has been planning her death? How does anyone recover from such a deep, painful betrayal? The first few days after the confrontation were the hardest. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. My mind wouldn't stop racing, replaying the moments leading up to that horrible truth. Every memory, every smile, every loving moment we shared was tainted by what had come to light. How could I have been so blind? How had I missed the signs? It was a constant loop of self-doubt, regret, and guilt. The betrayal stung in ways I didn't know were possible. And the guilt, oh the guilt. It gnawed at me day and night. I kept asking myself if I had failed him as a mother. Had I done something wrong? Had I missed something? Was there a point in his life where I could have intervened, where I could have stopped this from happening? The guilt was suffocating, and it wasn't just about the betrayal itself. It was the fact that I had spent so many years trusting him, loving him, believing that no matter what happened we would always be family. And now, that trust had been shattered beyond repair. But there was more to it than just the emotional fallout. The fallout wasn't just internal, it was external too. The impact of this betrayal rippled through every part of my life. Friends, family, people I had known for years, they all sensed the change. They could see the difference in me. And how could they not? The woman they had known, the mother, the strong, loving person who had always put family first, was now someone who had been shattered by the very core of that family. No one knew what to say, how to help. How could they? No one could understand what I was going through, not really. No one could understand what it felt like to have your own child turn against you, to have them be capable of such a monstrous thing. I found myself withdrawing from the world, retreating into myself, trying to process everything. It was as though I was living in a fog, unable to fully grasp what had happened or what would happen next. The house, once filled with warmth, now felt cold, empty. Didn't know how to fill the silence, how to fill the void that had been left behind. And I didn't know how to face the world anymore. How do you go on after something like this? But despite the overwhelming sadness, the anger, and the guilt, something inside me began to shift. I couldn't stay in this place of despair forever. As much as I wanted to curl up in a ball and pretend it had all been a bad dream, I knew that wasn't an option. I couldn't let this betrayal define me. I couldn't let it break me. I had spent my life surviving, loving, and fighting for what mattered, and I had to keep going. For myself. For my own survival. So, slowly I began to rebuild. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick. It was a slow, painful process, one where every step forward felt like 2 steps back. But I knew I had to face it. I had to confront the brokenness that had been created and try to put the pieces back together. It wasn't about forgiveness. Not yet. It wasn't even about fixing the relationship. It was about finding a way to survive the emotional storm that had been unleashed. It was about survival, plain and simple. I sought help. I reached out to people who had been through similar experiences, who understood the pain of betrayal and the toll it takes on the soul. I went to therapy, tried to work through the feelings of abandonment, of guilt, of hopelessness. It wasn't a magic fix. There were days when I wanted to give up, when the weight of it all felt too much to carry. But through it all I kept telling myself, you have to survive this. You have to keep going. The process was long, and there were many setbacks along the way. Some days felt like progress, while others felt like I was taking a giant leap backward. But each day I got a little stronger. Each day I learned to let go of some of the guilt, the anger, the self-blame. I began to accept that this betrayal wasn't my fault. It was his choice. And I couldn't carry the burden of it forever. There were times when I thought about what could have been. What our relationship could have looked like if things had gone differently. But the truth was, I could never go back to the way things were. The trust had been broken, and though I could rebuild myself, the relationship we once had was lost. And that was the hardest part, accepting that this wasn't just a temporary setback. This wasn't something we could fix overnight. This was the end of something deeply painful, and I had to find a way to heal from it. And through it all, I kept telling myself one thing. I am still here. I am still standing. No matter how much he had taken from me, no matter how much he had shattered, I was still here. I was still me. And that was something no one could ever take away. After the dust began to settle, I found myself in a strange, almost surreal place. The immediate emotional chaos had subsided, but the questions lingered, haunting me, following me, never quite letting me go. What went wrong? That question echoed in my mind, louder than any other thought. It wasn't just the betrayal itself that troubled me. It was the realization that somewhere, somehow, I had missed something. And the guilt that followed, the ache of self-doubt, was unbearable. I had raised my son with love, with care, with every intention of guiding him toward being a good person. I'd given him everything I had, and yet here we were, at this breaking point. How had I missed the signs? Where had I gone wrong? Was it in my approach? Had I been too lenient, too trusting? Or had I been too strict, too distant, too caught up in my own life to notice the subtle shifts in his behavior? The more I reflected on our relationship, the more I realized that there had been small, almost imperceptible changes over time. It wasn't just a sudden transformation. It was a gradual shift, one that I failed to recognize. I had been so focused on being a good mother, on doing the right thing, that I didn't see the cracks forming beneath the surface. I didn't see the way he was pulling away from me, the way his need for independence turned into isolation. I didn't see the quiet resentment building inside him, the bitterness festering, until it had grown into something unrecognizable. Was it my fault that he turned into this person? Was I to blame for the way he had been consumed by this darkness? These were the questions that tormented me as I sat alone, reflecting on the years we had spent together. I thought back to the times when we would sit and talk for hours, when he would tell me about his dreams, his fears, his hopes for the future. Those were the moments I treasured. But somewhere along the way, those moments had become fewer and farther between. He had started retreating into himself, closing off from me, and I had let it happen. I thought he just needed space. I thought it was just a phase. Looking back, I see now how naive I was. The signs were there, scattered throughout the years like breadcrumbs, but I was too caught up in the day-to-day of life to notice. How had I missed them? How had I failed to see that my son was struggling with something so deep, something so dark? Could I have done something differently? Could I have reached out to him before it was too late? But the truth is, I couldn't have stopped it. No matter how much I wish I could go back and change things, the reality is that I didn't know. I couldn't have known. As much as I wanted to blame myself, as much as I wanted to take on the weight of his actions, I had to come to terms with the fact that this was his choice. His actions were not my fault. And yet, the self-blame still gnawed at me, still made me question every decision I had ever made as a mother. I thought about the moments when we were close, when I was certain that I knew him inside and out. Those were the times when I felt like I had done everything right, that I had raised him to be kind, compassionate, and honest. But looking back now, I see how much of that was just me projecting my own beliefs onto him. I had assumed that because I loved him, he would always love me back in the same way. But love isn't a guarantee. And trust is fragile, so easily broken. And I had trusted him completely. I had given him my heart, my soul. And now, I had to face the consequences of that trust being shattered. It's painful to reflect on the years we spent together, to think about the person I thought he was, and the person he had become. I wonder where things went wrong. Was it the environment we created? Was it something in his upbringing? Or was it simply that somewhere along the way he lost his way? What caused him to make the decision to betray me? To betray his own mother in the most unimaginable way? These questions linger in my mind, and while I don't have the answers, I know that I have to come to terms with them. The hardest part of reflecting on this betrayal is understanding that sometimes we can't control the outcome. No matter how much we love someone, no matter how much we want to protect them, people change. People make choices. And those choices, no matter how much we wish we could stop them, belong to the person making them. As I reflect on everything, I realize that it's not about finding a definitive answer. It's about understanding that there is no perfect formula for raising a child, no guarantee that they will turn out exactly as we hope. What happened with my son is tragic, heartbreaking, and it will haunt me for the rest of my life. But in the end, I can only control my actions. I can't control his. And while the pain of this betrayal will never fully go away, I have to accept that there were things beyond my control, things I couldn't change. The only thing I can do now is move forward, learn from it, and let go of the guilt that has weighed me down for so long. After everything had fallen apart, after the devastating confrontation and the crushing weight of betrayal settled in, I knew that I had to rebuild. Rebuild my life, rebuild my sense of self, and most painfully, rebuild my trust in others. Trust, something I had taken for granted my whole life, had been shattered beyond recognition. And the most painful part, it was shattered by the very person I had trusted most in this world, my own son. In the aftermath, I found myself standing in a place I had never imagined I'd be. The ground beneath me felt unstable, like I was walking on thin ice. Everything I had known, everything I had believed about my family, about love, was now called into question. Trust was gone. And without trust, what was left? How could I rebuild, knowing that everything I had given, every ounce of love and sacrifice, had been met with deception and betrayal? The first step in the process of emotional recovery was accepting the truth. Accepting that this betrayal, no matter how painful, had happened. I couldn't change the past, and I couldn't undo what had been done. But I could control how I responded to it. I could control how I moved forward. That was the hardest part. Understanding that while I couldn't change what had happened, I could choose how I would heal from it. And the first thing I needed to do was heal myself. I spent time alone, reflecting on everything. I needed to clear my head, to quiet the storm of emotions that had consumed me. I started focusing on self-care, something I had neglected for far too long. I took long walks in nature, listened to music that calmed my soul, and even started meditating. It wasn't easy. Some days, the weight of the betrayal felt too heavy to carry. But I had to keep going. I couldn't let this betrayal define me, even though it had shaken me to my core. Part of me wanted to close off entirely, to never trust anyone again, to build walls so high that no one could ever get close enough to hurt me again. But I knew that wasn't healthy. I knew that if I wanted to heal, I couldn't live in isolation. I had to let go of the anger, the bitterness, and the fear that had taken root inside me. I had to learn how to trust again, not necessarily with my son, but with the people who hadn't betrayed me. I had to rebuild those connections and learn to trust that not everyone would do what my son had done. Trusting again in any capacity would take time, but it had to start with small steps. One of the hardest steps was confronting my own feelings of shame. For so long, I had blamed myself for what happened. I had questioned every decision I had made, every word I had said to him. I wondered if there was something I could have done differently to prevent this. But as I slowly began to heal, I realized that this wasn't my fault. I had done my best. I had loved him with all my heart, and I couldn't control his choices. Understanding that was freeing, even though it didn't make the pain any easier to bear. As I started rebuilding my emotional health, I also began to focus on my future. I couldn't stay stuck in the past forever. I had to keep moving forward no matter how painful it felt. I began setting new goals for myself, things I had always wanted to do but had put aside because I was so focused on being the perfect mother. I started taking care of myself again, mentally, emotionally, and physically. Slowly, I began to rediscover who I was outside of being a mother. I was no longer defined by this betrayal. I was more than that. I was a survivor. I also had to rebuild my sense of trust in my instincts. When you're blindsided by something as huge as betrayal, it can make you second-guess everything you've ever known. But with time, I learned to trust myself again. I learned to listen to that little voice inside me, the one that had warned me about what was happening before I even knew the full truth. It wasn't about being paranoid. It was about learning to trust my intuition and not dismissing it just because I didn't want to believe the worst. Through this process, I also realized that forgiveness, though a distant goal, was something I had to consider, even if it wasn't for my son. Forgiveness isn't about excusing what was done to you or pretending like it didn't happen. Forgiveness is about releasing the hold that anger and bitterness have on you. It's about freeing yourself from the emotional weight that the betrayal carries. I wasn't ready to forgive my son, not yet, but I knew that forgiveness was something I would have to work toward, if only for my own peace of mind. As I continued to heal, I found strength in my relationships with others. I leaned on my friends, my family, those who hadn't betrayed me. They became my lifeline, my support system. They reminded me that I was still worthy of love, of trust, and of happiness. With their help, I slowly began to piece my life back together. I learned that even in the face of betrayal, there was still beauty in the world. There were still people who cared for me, who would never hurt me, who would stand by me through the darkest moments. The process of rebuilding wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick. There were setbacks, moments of doubt, and days when the pain seemed unbearable. But I kept moving forward. One step at a time, I began to rebuild not just my trust in others but my trust in myself. And that was the most important thing. I had to believe that no matter what had happened, I was capable of healing. I was capable of moving forward. I didn't know what the future held, and I didn't know where my relationship with my son would go. But I knew that I was stronger than I had ever realized. I had survived the unthinkable, and I had come out the other side, scarred but not broken. And as I continued on my journey of emotional recovery, I knew that no matter what came next, I would face it with the resilience I had found within myself. In the aftermath of everything that had happened, I found myself reflecting on the lessons I had learned through the pain, the betrayal, and the long process of recovery. It wasn't easy to see the lessons at first. When you're in the depths of emotional turmoil, it feels like everything has been broken beyond repair. But slowly, as I began to heal and piece my life back together, the lessons became clear. And those lessons, though painful, have shaped me into a stronger, wiser person. They've taught me the value of trust and the importance of never losing sight of my own self-worth. The first lesson, and perhaps the hardest one to swallow, was about trust. Trust isn't something that can be given blindly or freely. It has to be earned. Trust is fragile, and it takes time to build, but only a moment to shatter. I had trusted my son completely, without question, without hesitation. I had believed in him so fully that I ignored the warning signs, the little red flags that something was amiss. In a way, I had placed all my faith in him, expecting him to return that trust in kind. But what I learned the hard way is that trust isn't just about giving. It's about mutual respect, understanding, and responsibility. It's about understanding that trust must be safeguarded, that both parties must honor it. When trust is broken, the pain isn't just about the betrayal itself. It's about the loss of something deeply fundamental to human connection. Trust is the foundation of any relationship, whether it's between family members, friends, or romantic partners. Once it's gone, it's hard to rebuild, and it takes time. But I learned that while it takes time to rebuild trust with others, it starts with rebuilding trust in myself. The fact that someone close to me had betrayed that trust made me question everything, and it forced me to take a step back and ask myself, what did I miss? Why did I ignore the signs? Why did I trust so easily? The second lesson was about self-worth. For so long, my identity had been wrapped up in being a mother, in the relationship I had with my son. And when that relationship shattered, it felt like I had lost myself, like I wasn't enough, like I had failed. But as I began to heal, I realized something crucial. I am worthy. I am worthy of love, of respect, of happiness. No one's actions, no matter how painful or devastating, define my worth. I had spent so much of my life measuring my worth through the lens of others, through my role as a mother, a caregiver, a provider. But my worth isn't defined by what anyone else does or doesn't do. My worth is inherent, and that's something no betrayal can take away. This lesson was incredibly hard to accept because it meant letting go of the guilt I had carried for so long. I had blamed myself for everything: the betrayal, the broken relationship, the emotional turmoil. I thought that somehow I was responsible, that I had done something wrong. But the truth was that he made his choices. I didn't make them for him. And though I couldn't control what had happened, I could control how I responded. I could control how I rebuilt my own life and how I chose to view myself. The third lesson was about boundaries. Throughout this experience, I had to learn to set boundaries. Not just with my son, but with myself as well. There was a time when I would have done anything for him, when I would have forgiven anything and accepted anything in the name of love. But I learned that love doesn't mean accepting bad behavior or allowing someone to walk all over you. Love doesn't mean ignoring your own needs in favor of someone else's. It means respecting yourself enough to know when something is wrong, when someone has crossed a line, and when it's time to stand up for yourself. Setting boundaries with my son, telling him that what he had done was unacceptable, and that I couldn't continue to let him manipulate me, was one of the hardest things I had ever done. But it was necessary. It was necessary for my own healing, and it was necessary for me to regain control of my life. I had to protect myself emotionally and mentally, and that meant creating distance, setting limits, and saying, no more. It wasn't easy, and it didn't come without its own emotional cost, but it was one of the most empowering things I had ever done. And lastly, the biggest lesson was about forgiveness. Not for him, but for myself. It's easy to forgive others when they ask for it, when they show remorse, when they try to make amends. But when they don't care, when they don't take responsibility, forgiveness becomes an internal process. It becomes about letting go of the anger, the resentment, the bitterness that can keep you stuck in the past. Forgiveness isn't about excusing what happened. It's about freeing yourself from the emotional chains that the betrayal creates. And through that process, I learned that true forgiveness starts within. It starts with forgiving myself for not seeing the signs, for trusting when I should have been more cautious, for allowing myself to be hurt. But I also had to forgive myself for feeling weak, for feeling like I wasn't enough. I had to learn to accept that I was worthy of peace, of healing, and that forgiving myself was an essential part of moving forward. These lessons weren't easy to learn. The pain of betrayal, the heartbreak of losing someone you loved deeply, doesn't just disappear overnight. But over time, I learned that the most important thing is to never lose sight of your own worth, to trust in your ability to heal, and to understand that your life doesn't have to be defined by someone else's choices. I may never fully understand what went wrong, or why my son chose the path he did. But what I do know is that I am stronger because of it. I am wiser, and I am learning every day that no matter what happens, I can rebuild, can grow, can move forward. It's been a long, painful journey, one that I never could have imagined walking. When everything fell apart, when I discovered the depth of my son's betrayal, I felt like my world had shattered into a million pieces. I didn't know how I was going to pick them up, how I was going to move forward. But as time passed, as I faced each new day, I began to understand something crucial. This was not the end of my story. It was just a new chapter. A chapter where I would find my strength, my resilience, and ultimately my peace. Healing from such a deep betrayal doesn't happen overnight. It's not a simple linear process where one day you wake up and everything is magically okay. No, healing is messy, complicated, and often painful. It's like stitching together a wound that keeps reopening every time you think you're getting better. But slowly you start to heal. Slowly you begin to see the light again. It's not about forgetting what happened, not about pretending that everything is fine. It's about learning how to live with the pain, how to use it as fuel for your growth, how to take the broken pieces and transform them into something stronger, something more powerful. The road to healing isn't just about recovering from the betrayal. It's about reclaiming your power. It's about remembering who you are, what you stand for, and not allowing anyone or anything to take that away from you. When my son betrayed me, he tried to take away my trust, my sense of security, and my peace. But what he didn't realize was that he couldn't take my strength. He couldn't take my resilience. And he couldn't take my ability to heal and grow. I've learned that healing isn't just about getting over the betrayal. It's about rebuilding yourself, piece by piece, stronger and wiser. It's about understanding that no matter what happens, no matter how many times you're knocked down, you can rise again. You can rebuild. You can move forward. And that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm rebuilding my life, my trust, and my sense of self-worth. And no one can take that from me. As I continue this journey of healing, I've also come to realize that empowerment comes from within. It comes from facing your fears, your pain, and your doubts head-on. Comes from choosing not to be defined by the actions of others but to define your own path, your own future. No one can dictate your worth or your journey. You are the one who holds the power to determine how you move forward, how you rebuild, and how you heal. I'm not the same person I was before. I've been changed by this experience, in ways that are still unfolding. But one thing is clear. I am stronger for having gone through it. I am wiser. And most importantly, I am free. Free from the pain of betrayal. Free from the chains of guilt and self-doubt. Free to move forward and embrace the future. And that's the ultimate lesson I've learned through all of this. Healing is not about erasing the past. It's about embracing your power to move forward, no matter what. It's about owning your story, accepting what happened, and using it as fuel to become the best version of yourself. So, as I continue my journey of healing and empowerment, I do so with the knowledge that no matter what comes next, I will face it with strength, resilience, and the unwavering belief that I am worthy of happiness, peace, and love. The journey of healing and empowerment after betrayal is not a straight path. It's messy, painful, and at times downright overwhelming. But if there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that we are so much stronger than we give ourselves credit for. No matter how deep the betrayal, no matter how shattered you may feel, you have the power to rise again. It might not be easy, and it might not happen overnight, but piece by piece, you can rebuild yourself and reclaim your strength. Don't let betrayal define you. Don't let the actions of others strip away your self-worth or your sense of security. You have the power to choose how you move forward, how you heal, and how you take back your life. If you're still struggling to find that strength, I encourage you to keep going. Don't stop fighting for your peace, your happiness, and your trust in yourself. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a betrayal that shook you to your core? How did you rebuild? Let's continue the conversation in the comments. I'd love to hear your story. And before you go, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you can keep learning, growing, and healing with me. Together we can navigate the pain and emerge stronger, wiser, and more empowered than ever before.